Welcome everybody. My name is Rupert Till. I'm chair of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, and this is our monthly research seminar. This is our February research seminar, and it's presented and hosted by IASPM's South East Asia branch, which is a fairly new branch. Today, we're very fortunate to have ADIL Johan, I've probably pronounced his name wrong, presenting for us. He is a research fellow and senior lecturer at the Institute for Ethnic Studies at the University Kebangsaan, Malaysia. Again, apologies for terrible pronunciation. And I'll allow him to, I'll just pass over to him. We'll be going for about 30 to 40 minutes and then open the floor to questions, at which point feel free to either post your questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask the question, or maybe put your hand up using Zoom if you're used to that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Adil.
Thank you very much, Professor Rupert Till, and thank you very much for actually doing most of the work in organizing and putting together the Eventbrite event. And thank you everyone for coming today. We're very happy on behalf of the Southeast Asia IASPM branch, IASPM C. We're very excited and very happy to be a part of this wonderful online series of seminars and presentations. And we hope for those of you who are still not too familiar with Southeast Asia and the music from there, we hope that we can give you a little bit of an introduction to some of the work that we're doing. It's very exciting stuff. Needless to say, research on music in Southeast Asia is far from young or new. We have a lot of established scholarship, especially from the fields of ethnomusicology, on musics of especially traditional and folk music of Southeast Asia. And of course, the study of popular music has also existed in these ethnomusicological works. However, to actually institutionalize, so to speak, the study of popular music in IASPM, I think is a new start. But that's not to say that it's never existed before. I guess it's just a bunch of young scholars got together and decided, hey, let's try to do something for popular music in Southeast Asia specifically, but we're not bound by any disciplinary limitations. Of course, we're all trans and interdisciplinary here as well in how we approach our work. I'm going to share screen of my presentation now. Okay, here we go. Let's hope it's the right one. Okay, audio. I have some audio as well for everyone, for you. Right. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, so the title I have today, Conceptualizing an Intimately Connected Nusantara, the Rock Kapak Phenomenon of the 1980s and 1990s. The term Rock Kapak has to be said with a grain of salt and with a little caveat in terms of whether the practitioners and fans of this actually agree with the term, but it is a commonly used term of the genre. I'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, let's move on. Okay, let's see, next slide. Okay, just a little outline for today. The first thing that I want to do is probably go over a little conceptualization of the Malay world as Nusantara, or the term Nusantara. And just a little side note, this presentation actually forms a major part of the introduction to a recently published, well, it will be published in March this year, a volume called Made in Nusantara Studies in Popular Music, co-edited with my very good friend, Dr. Michael A. Santaella, who is working with us in Malaysia at Stanley University, and he's joining us today as well. So I'm sure he can fill in the gaps in the areas that I didn't cover when it comes to certain concepts and ideas. And I'm also looking forward to a lively discussion about this very term, Nusantara. Okay, and then I'm going to go into some inter-regional and global exchanges that were happening in Malay rock music specifically in the 1980s. And then I will try to dish out the Rock Kapak Phenomenon of the 1990s. And I'll feature one of my case studies is actually this Malaysian rock band called Search that was very widely popular in Indonesia in the 1990s. So we're going to look at Search playing its music across borders. And then for those of you who have attended my previous presentation, I love using this term, rocking onwards. But basically, just a fancy way of saying I'm going to figure out a way to conclude and maybe give some ideas on where this research can move further forward. Just a bonus track, if time permits, I had to obviously do a lot of slashing for this presentation when I realized there's way too much information in this slide. If we have time, maybe we can listen to and talk a little bit about Malay rock, the precursor to the Malay rock of the 1980s, which is the Malay rock and roll scene of the 1960s and 1970s. So, conceptualizing the Malay world as Nusantara. I hate to be the person that pulls out a map, but I'm going to do it only because I think for the benefit of our international audience, for those of you who may not be familiar with Southeast Asia, I just wanted to situate the study in where it is and also to introduce you to Southeast Asia a little bit. I'm conceptualizing Nusantara specifically. It is not Southeast Asia, but it is a conception of the Malay-speaking world that dates back to thousands of years, especially to pre-colonial times, of course. But of course, a lot of these state boundaries are a result of Western imperialism and colonialism. But as they are now, the Nusantara, for me, as I understand it, it includes Malaysia, which is tied to two continents or two islands. Malaysia is tied to the mainland, and then we have Indonesia, and we also want to include the Philippines as part of this Nusantara equation. And I'll explain a little bit why we're doing that. In earlier times, in maritime Southeast Asia is another way to conceptualize this space. In pre-colonial times, these spaces of influences were understood in terms of a mandala or a circle, or they were borderless, but they did have imperial centers, which then emanated outwards in influence. There were centers and there were peripheries, but they were not thought of in terms of the kind of rigid state boundaries that we think of now. And in many ways, these traces or resonances of culture carries much towards today, and of course, very much so in the music of the region, and of course, the language. So I wanted to think about the Nusantara as part of this long history of these different spheres of influence of these pre-colonial maritime Southeast Asia empires. In particular, the influential empires were the Srivijayan Empire and Majapahit. Okay. Sometime in the 1960s, there was a plan, and this was an idea that was mooted by the late great Jose Rizal from the Philippines, to form a coalition of nations of Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia called Mafilindo. Unfortunately, there was a convention that was held, but the plan to have that didn't materialize because Malaysia then gained its independence from British powers and formed the Federation of Malaysia that did not have this other two countries in the equation. President Sukarno of Indonesia at the time was very upset about that, and that actually led to a mini war called the confrontation or confrontasi. I'll talk a little bit more about that later if we have time. The other use of the word, the beginnings of the use of the word Nusantara, we start to see in modern times in 1973, when there was an organization of writers, literary writers, who met and convened at a conference. And this included writers who wrote obviously in the Malay language, and a lot of them included writers from Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, and I think there were some from Singapore, Malay writers from Singapore as well. And they called this organization Organisasi Sastrawan Nusantara, or Nusantara Writers Organization. And actually predating that, we actually have Islam Nusantara, which actually finds its use towards the 1950s or towards the more modern times, actually, in Indonesia. And this was started by a group called Nadlatul Ulama, which was established in 1926. And it was a brand of Islam that was very, it had roots in Sufism and the Shafi'i school of Islam. And it was a brand of Islam that was trying to be very inclusive of the, number one, the diversity of Islam, so the way that Islam is being practiced in that region, in Indonesia, and also the diversity of cultures and pre-Islamic cultures that were existing as well. So there was this inclusive vision of what Islam could be in Indonesia. And it also ties very closely to the Indonesian motto Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, which roughly translates as unity in diversity. And recently we've seen an endorsement of Islam Nusantara by President Jokowi in 2015. So Nusantara still rings true. And of course, the etymology of the word Nusantara then is actually from the Malay language, means Nusa Antara. And roughly translated, Antara means in between or including, but Nusa means islands. As you can see, maritime Southeast Asia is a conglomeration of many different islands separated by oceans, but there's a lot of fluidity and there's a lot of movement between all these spaces. And that's something I think that is the primary feature of conceptualizing Nusantara, is this porosity and fluidity between these different islands and spaces that also speak a certain language and have a lineage and a shared culture. So yes, so Nusantara for me, and for what we try to propose in our book, Made in Nusantara, is a shared space. But more so, we're also trying to use this term as a means to decolonize these ideas, decolonize the nation-state boundaries that have existed due to the legacies of European empires in the region. And therefore, we're trying to also move this away from all these ethno-hegemonic discourses that are actually perpetuated in these current nation states. For example, in Malaysia, Malay ethno-nationalism rings very strongly, right? But we are also trying to find a way to decolonize that and to decenter the narrative away from Malay-centric or nation-state-centric discourses and narratives. We're also trying to decenter the exclusive use of Nusantara in Indonesia, even though we see a lot of use in it in Indonesia's history, but we want to make it a more inclusive conceptual term for the entire, for the whole of maritime Southeast Asia. And we also want to include, of course, the Philippines, which actually has a long legacy in this connection. And the Philippines, I think, is also very important because the Philippines was a kind of was an early colonial, an early space that was colonized very early on in the history of the region. And it was an entry point for Western music, actually, through Spanish colonialism. And so we find that a lot of Western or popular music legacies in the region come from people from the Philippines. And then it is then circulated through these Nusantara networks across over time and space until now. And of course, inclusivity is at the heart of using the term Nusantara. Of course, within the maritime Southeast Asian space, we can get into a little bit of discussion about how can we now then be, inclusive with Southeast Asia or maybe Greater Asia and so on. But for now, we think that Nusantara fits very well within this sphere of maritime Southeast Asia or the Malay-speaking world. And of course, we want to also complicate these ideas and these interactions. We want to complicate we want to highlight the complexity of the interactions that have happened historically and are currently also happening in the region. The term Nusantara in popular music, however, you start to see that, interestingly, in Malaysia in the 1990s. And this was in line with the world beat trend that was happening across the world. I mean, of course, Paul Simon's Graceland album comes to mind, right? As a progenitor of this movement or this trend. But the trend was also resonating across the world, and Malaysia was no stranger to it. But artists and producers and songwriters in Malaysia tried to incorporate traditional and folk elements of music from their region. Interestingly, Malaysian artists that push forward this idea of balada Nusantara or Nusantara ballads actually drew a lot from Indonesian cultures as well. And this is where we have to complicate it. I mean, is it Indonesian or is it something that's shared across the region, which also kind of, for me, justifies why we need to use the term Nusantara, right? But of course, then the problem then lies in that why is it the Malaysian artists that are they appropriating the term Nusantara, and are they then also appropriating the music from other regions, you know, and then calling it a Malaysian kind of music? So there's a lot of complications and problematics that go into the term Balada Nusantara, but based on what some initial analysis that we've done, and in a chapter that I want to draw your attention to, which by my friend Michael Santayala, who wrote a chapter, who co-edited this book and has his own chapter, very interesting work. He classifies Balada Nusantara as a national genre based on global popular music. Maybe we can get Michael also to chime in on this a bit later when we get into the deeper discussion. So there are many ways to understand Nusantara, but right now at this stage of the study, this is where we're at. We see the term Nusantara conceptually used in popular music that is made in Malaysia, but at the same time, I feel that this is a term that can be applied as a means of analyzing popular music in the region, both in contemporaneous context and in historical context. So why do I think this is so? Without actually using the word Nusantara, the music of Malay rock in the 1980s, that started sometime in the 1980s, demonstrated a lot of instances of interregional and global exchanges. One of the most popular bands, one of the most famous bands at the time in the 1980s, was a band called Sweet Charity. And they were actually a Singaporean band, but they wrote all their songs in the Malay language, and they appealed widely to a Malay-speaking market in Malaysia across the causeway, and also to some extent in Indonesia. But we do know that they're very big in the Malay Peninsula. Their most famous song is a song called Camelia. Oh wait, it's a song called Camelia. But before we get our ears into it, I'm gonna kind of paint the scene of what the was like. So here's a picture I found of Ramli Sarip, the lead singer of Sweet Charity, and this is them featured in a magazine called Penghibur. And they were playing, this Singaporean band was playing a gig, and actually quite a pretty big concert of 10,000 people in Johor, just at the border of Singapore, right? The Malaysian city that's at the border of Singapore and Malaysia. And this article makes a big deal about them causing quite a ruckus in this concert. What happened was Ramli Sarip sang a song called Beautiful Johor Girl, or Gadis Johor Cantik. And it actually caused quite a ruckus according to this article, this report. It's a magazine article, so it could also be kind of tabloidy and sensationalized. But apparently when he sang about how beautiful Johor girls were, a portion of the audience was upset about this and started to cause, you know, kecoh lah. They started to cause some ruckus. And then they had to cut the concert. But then later on, they came back and they were able to perform and they were still popular. But it's just some sensationalism about perhaps the subversiveness of the rock culture of the time. As you can see, Ramli Sarip screaming away in a leopard print shirt, right? Okay, so let's have a listen to one of their top songs. Okay, this is Ebiet G. He's actually Ebiet G. He is actually Indonesian, a very famous and established Indonesian singer-songwriter. And Sweet Charity, what they did in their album Pelarian in 1980, what they did was they took his song. Well, of course, they credited him, but they refashioned it into a rock version. So we're going to spend some time to listen to this. Let's see what you think. Please let me know if you can't hear it. So I'm just going to pause it over there, and I apologize if there was some stops here and there. My computer had to remind me that I was actually not plugged in for power. Well, that would have been disastrous. I hope everyone heard that okay. Can I just get a little feedback on if that was heard? Take that as
yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next example here. So I found out from a very good friend of mine, who I will credit in a bit, that the introduction of this song, aside from also drawing from Indonesian resources, this Singaporean band also pretty much covered an introduction to Didi Bridgewater's version of Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word. So if you can remember what you just heard, here's the introduction to Bridgewater's song. So there you have it. It's pretty close, save for obviously the instrumentation compared to Switch. I just have a listen to it again, and I think like Raja Iskandar, my friend who also writes a lot about this, was so intrigued by this, and then he shared this to me, and we were both mind blown. But I mean, obviously, in reality, that's what was happening a lot in the recording industry of the Nusantara and in other parts of the world. I mean, people were borrowing music. They were doing it legally as well. There were copyright for certain songs. For example, in the Malay world, in the Nusantara, we have a genre of songs called saduran, which is basically songs from other parts of the world that are then rewritten in Malay lyrics. You know, and if you notice the discographies, if you go into the albums, you'll see that these songs will have Malay titles, but they'll have in brackets copyright control, and that's usually kind of like a hint that this is a saduran song or a cover song. So there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of work that's yet to be done actually on this issue of covers as well. But I highly urge you, once again, sorry to plug this again, but please check out the book Made in Nusantara. There's a lot of interesting information about that as well, and about the music that's shared across the region and beyond the region. And so yeah, so this is Sweet Charity, you know, Indonesian songwriter, American cover of a cover, introduction, you know, re-instrumentalized, and this is what was happening in the 1980s. So let's go to Rock Kapak, 1990s. For my Malaysian and Indonesian friends, I was asked to clarify this. Why is the term Rock Kapak used? Rock Kapak. I'll explain a little bit. I'm very thankful to the amazing work done by Dr. Taqiyuddin Hassan, who's currently doing some wonderful ethnography on musicians from the 80s and 90s. And I highly urge you to check out his Facebook page. It is in Malay, though. A lot of his work is in Malay and is written there, but maybe I'm sure Facebook is smart enough to translate that now. So yeah, please check it out. He's written some amazing stuff. I can't wait to see his work, but this is why it's called Rock Kapak. So the first theory behind the term Rock Kapak, and mind you, this is a term that has been used only very recently, actually, since the 2000s, is that a lot of the performances and shows by these bands were played in car parks. And usually they were car parks, usually they were shows that were stages that were set up in open spaces, and sometimes these open spaces were connected to fun fairs or to night markets and things like that. And this is where a lot of these gigs were held. So Rock Kapak, car park. Theory number 2 is that there's a term that that Malay say, kapak pala a bit, which basically means, oh man, that was awesome. Oh, that was mind-blowing, dude. You know, like, so that's a rough translation, but the term kapak was used as a term of wildness, of being wild musically. And then, of course, the most obvious one for me is that kapak is literally translates to the word axe in Malay. So in Anglo-American rock music, the axe is your guitar or instrument, right? So guitar rock. And of course, I mean, of course, the guitar rock is characterized by a lot of fancy solos, right? Rock solos that you find in glam rock and heavy metal. And the other one, really interesting theory by Dr. Taqiyuddin, is kapak bersilang, which means cross access. So back then in the 80s and 90s, piracy was huge, and a lot of people who couldn't afford original merchandise had to buy pirated merchandise. And there was a brand of pirated rock cassettes that had this logo, this kapak, this cross X logo. So it's an unofficial label, of course. And another interesting sonic theory for those of you who are interested in this is that kapak relates to the pak sound or the snare, that solid snare that you hear in all these rock, in heavy rock ballads and whatnot, right? Or that backbeat. So these are the 5 theories right now about Rock Kapak. There's a lot that we can get into this. I think that needs to be done. So I invite anyone who's interested, let's do it. Let's go into it. Okay, so the other one that we have to look at is the social aspects of rock culture in the 80s and 90s. There was a special report by a magazine called the Far Eastern Economic Review in 1989, right? And this was a quote from a government minister, a Malaysian minister, about the phenomenon of all these young Malay, mostly male youths gravitating towards these rock concerts, wearing tight jeans, you know, and he thinks it's a heavy metal culture. Yes, there are connections to bands like Poison, Def Leppard, Scorpions, and these were the influential bands of the time. And he said that heavy metal, by heavy metal he means this Malay rock culture, is a subculture that is a negative attempt to, to hinge Malay, to change, sorry for the spelling mistake, to change Malay norms and values, right? Okay, so it's a threat, immediate threat to Malayness, to Malay tradition and values. We worry about kutus, same minister. They have taken on traits that are bad. Young men wearing earrings, clothes that are dirty, unruly hair. Such behavior leaves an indelible impression, and we are worried that when these young people get older, they will not be in a position to be responsible and run the country. And this was actually an interview with Najib Razak. It was an article that featured a bunch of interviews with different people. And Najib Razak at the time, he was a youth and sports minister. For those of you who are familiar with Malaysian politics, Najib is now the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, who is embroiled in a very messy and very horrible corruption scandal called the 1MDB scandal. And I thought it was interesting that we had Najib Razak as a youth minister commenting on youth in such a conservative fashion. But it's also very much a reflection of hegemonic Malay state culture, or Malaysian conservatism at the state level, and how subcultures were viewed as threats to the existing to existing norms, you know. And you can see, I mean, if there's a reaction, if there's this moral panic or anxiety towards it, it must have been a pretty relevant and huge culture as well. This was a period when there was a lot of rural to urban migration. There was rapid development in Malaysia as well. And you have swaths of youth, of young males and females coming to work in the city, also probably finding new forms of freedom, new outlets of expression, but also there's a lot of class inequalities that are happening at the time as well. So this is an area that I'm particularly interested in, is the social, cultural, and economic aspects, of course, the issues of class and subculture that are concerned with this rock culture that was happening at the time. And this is, of course, focused on the fans, on the listeners, on the audiences, on the consumers. And yeah, that's what was happening in the 1980s and 90s. Now, what we have with Rock Kapak And the term rock kapak also is problematic, actually. I just wanted to put that out there as a provocation, actually. Is that, why is it problematic? Maybe we can talk about it at the end of the presentation. Now, rock kapak is actually, I see it as is part of this retro revival, and as part of this kind of structural nostalgia that's happening across Malaysia. It's a retro revival in that when you listen to Malay radio, and if you go to YouTube and listen to Malaysian, specifically Malaysian pop music, a lot of these ballad songs are drawing formal aspects from the rock kapak ballads, which are seen as classics and evergreen classics today. But you see newer artists such as Aiman Tino and other singers and whatnot, they have ballads, and these ballads will sound like, you know, very sweet, slow, sentimental ballads. But then you hear this distorted rock guitar solo somewhere in the middle eight, you know, and that really calls back to this rock kapak and this Malay rock aesthetic of the 1980s and 1990s. You also now have a tremendous amount of nostalgia. The fans of rock kapak at the time in the 80s and 90s are now well endowed. Most of them are well endowed adults, you know, older adults in their 30s and 40s and 50s even. And you have these very interesting cassette and LP reissues, where LPs were probably not released before. Now you have audiophiles who really want to listen to Search and Sweet Charity, you know, on heavy and on high quality vinyl. You know, you have all these reissues. I have a CD reissue from Japan, so these reissues are being sent to Japan and they are coming back. Actually, no, I don't have that. I'm not rich enough to get that. But there are also local companies that are doing CD and cassette reissues, and there's some interesting and very lively Facebook groups that are happening as well. Just check it out if you're interested. But what I find very interesting right now in the research on Malay rock in the 1980s and 1990s is this idea of rock as hijrah, okay? And hijrah is the Muslim term for spiritual migration. And I want to draw attention to two very important studies on this, if you're interested. Dominic Mueller writes about Islamic politics and popular culture in Malaysia, negotiating normative change between Sharia law and electric guitars. And in this, he does an ethnography of the Islamic party PAS, Parti Islam Malaysia, in the northern state of Peninsular Malaysia, Kelantan. And he finds that sometime in the north, in the 2010s, this Islamic party were reaching out to youth and doing programs where they would actually play rock music, because of course their voting demographic now are the people who were fans of rock kapak in the 1980s, 90s. And you have a huge amount of rock musicians from the 80s and 90s who have hijrah, who have spiritually migrated to a stronger path in Islam, who have taken on a more Islamic way of life and have taken on that practice. You even have the lead singer for the band I'm going to talk about, Search, visiting the Islamic leader, the late past Islamic leader, Allahyarham Nik Aziz. And you have, it's quite a phenomenon. And I guess for Dominic Mueller, he found it very interesting that as he's studying Islam and political Islam, there are all these rock and loud rock guitars were also, the rock culture was also used to entice members into the Islamic party. Of course, it's very much embedded into Malaysian and Malay culture already, right, historically. So my friend Raja Iskandar, who alerted me to the DD Bridgewater connection, wrote a chapter in our book called Hijrah and the Rise of Nasyid Contemporary in Malaysia. And here he conceptualizes the idea of hijrah as a spiritual migration that can be linked to the spiritual migration of musicians, specifically popular musicians, from a kind of secular background to a more Islamic one, and how they've adapted to it. And he highlights some interesting cases of former rock guitarists who are now making nasyid music, and some of them are still also playing rock as well. So I think it's a very interesting phenomenon that needs to be studied further. And please read these articles. Okay, on to my case study. I've already taken up, I think, a good 25 minutes, but I'll be ending soon after this case study. This is the band Search. You can see, I hope this gives you a taste of the style. Some people characterize this era of rock in Malaysia as glam rock. There's a really good article by Marco Ferraris on that. You can see that in the makeup that's worn, in the hairstyles, in the fashion, you know. And this is Amy's search right here, and his bandmates. That's Hilary Ang, the guitarist. Wait, no, that's Hilary. That's Hilary right there at the back. And or somebody please correct me. I think I might have gotten that wrong. And you can see that that's kind of like the aesthetic that they're going for. This glam rock, heavy metal kind of thing that you see in bands like Whitesnake and Poison. In the States and the UK. Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing that article. Please check it out, okay? And this was their #1 album. The reason why this album was so important was because they sold something like I have my figures here. Let's see, how much did you sell in Indonesia? They sold, I think, close to a few million copies. I'm so sorry, I have my notes here, but I'm fumbling over them. Let's see, search 1996 song to sell. Okay, record-breaking album. They sold 250,000 units in Malaysia alone, which is huge, and they also sold 1 million units in Indonesia. And for a Malaysian band to penetrate the Indonesian market in the 1990s was a huge feat back then. So Search was indeed a phenomenon. They also did actually record part of the album in Jakarta as well. So there's a lot of cross-border activity that's happening. And obviously it's also to tap into that lucrative Indonesian market. But for some reason, Indonesians were really taken by Search and their style of music. And this was something that if you talk to Indonesian music fans, this was something that was quite unique as a Malaysian brand. Like it was quite unique musically as well. And Indonesians lapped it up, and now they do it. Indonesians are doing it much better than Malaysians, you know, as they normally do with music. But yeah, we can have a little talk about that. Maybe you can share, maybe there's insights that I'm not aware of yet, but they made it huge in Indonesia, and that was a feat in itself. Okay. Another testament to that, to the success in Indonesia was, well, aside from making a film in Malaysia based on the album name, they also made a film in Indonesia in the same year in 1990 called Isabella, which is based on their most famous song. And their most famous song is not a driving hard, you know, rock anthem. It's actually a ballad. Some would argue it's a power ballad. And the ballad, the Malay rock ballad, is intrinsic to the Rock Kapak genre and its circulation, its continued circulation in Malaysian society and in Nusantara society. This is a song that is very widely known in Indonesia as well. Okay. Jeremy Wallach talks about this concept of scenic infrastructures, where he studied heavy metal on, I can also apply the same to rock across Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. Although his study is even more interesting because these are underground heavy metal bands, you know. But he says that there's this conceptualization of scenic infrastructures that sustain region-wide networks of cultural and musical exchange involving touring musicians and the wide circulation of musical and textual artifacts. Basically, he's saying that there is a very specific scenic infrastructure in the Malay-speaking world that allows for this circulation of artifacts, products, and sounds, and music, and genres, you know. We can get a little bit more into that. This is the song Isabella. And I dedicate this to my friend Isabella Peck, who is also one of the chair of the IASPM South East Asia branch. I'm sure you get this a lot. Everyone in Malaysia probably sings the song Isabella when they hear your name. But these are some excerpts from the lyrics. And for our friends who don't speak Malay, so Isabella is the love story of two worlds. Why did we meet only to be separated? The day is lost, engulfed by the darkness of night. Worlds torn apart ends this tale. She is Isabella, symbol of doomed love. Separated because of different cultural beliefs. Love fades with withering leaves. It sounds really strange in English, actually, but you know, if you're a fan, I mean, just to capture, I mean, it's a very sentimental song, it's heart-wrenching, but I think the thing I wanted to focus on was that you're talking about these cultural divides, right? And it's like the doomed Romeo and Juliet love story where people from different backgrounds who love each other can't be together, you know. And I guess that makes for really good ballads and really good songs. So this is Isabella in the film. It's a clip of the film Isabella. And what happens is Amy plays himself and he meets an Indonesian girl named surprise, Isabella, in Malaysia, and she is a daughter of these Indonesian diplomats. But her parents say, no, you cannot. And she, obviously they meet and they fall in love. And her parents are like, no, you can't hang out with him because he's a rock musician and he drinks beer and he's from a bad influence. And in Indonesia, there was a rock concert and all hell broke loose, you know? And she's like, no, but I love him, obviously. So in this scene, which features the song, she's running towards him because she has, I think she has to leave. I didn't really get to see the whole film because it was taken off YouTube. But for those of you who have seen it, please help me out. But I'm going to assume that it's because she was about to leave back for Indonesia, and she meets up with Serge, and then eventually Serge tries to find her in Indonesia when Amy tries to find her in Indonesia. So here's a little clip of Isabella.
Lagu ini saya persembahkan khusus untuk Isabella.
All right, I was informed that obviously I'm cutting into time, so I'm gonna try and push this through. That's Isabella, please check it out. Recently, Amy is still popular in Indonesia. Recently, he was found at a promotional campaign for Jakarta's new MRT. And this thing says Amy is disguised in Jakarta, attracts attention. But yeah, he was there to promote the MRT, and it's still very popular. This is a music singing show where most of the audience is Indonesian, and they sing Isabella word for word, and then he appears as a surprise in the end. Please check this out. Oh my God, okay. Don't worry, I'm actually just concluding. Okay, so hopefully you got to see, okay, you know what, I'm just gonna go to the end. These last few videos that I showed you was of Amy walking the streets of Jakarta to promote the new MRT. He's still very popular in Indonesia now. He appears now and then also in Indonesian television, and this is a singing competition of which the crowd, mostly Indonesians, sang along word for word. Okay, no worries, Rupert, no worry, I'll move on. Okay, thank you. And okay, I'll just go on to the conclusion. So rocking onwards, right? Analyzing popular music in an intimately connected Malay world offers an epistemological means to conceptualize the Nusantara as a maritime space of fluid identities, affinities, and contestations. And I hope I've been able to show that in the examples that I've given. And for me, listening to Malay Rock Kapak with scare quotes, yeah, as a regional phenomenon also unearths the intercultural intimacies of Nusantara youth in an increasingly urbanized and globalized context. I didn't really get to talk too much about interculture, but you can see that in the tortured relationship between Malaysians and Indonesians that are played out in the song Isabella and in the film. This retrospective youth culture is rooted, well, retrospective because we're looking back at it now, is rooted to local expressions of sentimentality and narrations of the social anxieties experienced in a period of rapid economic development during the 1980s and 1990s. And I hope that we can further explore issues for this, around this topic. I haven't really dished out issues of nationalism versus regionalism versus interculturalism. There's also a lot of multicultural interactions that are happening within Malaysia, within Indonesia, within bands that I talk about in other research. And my current research project right now with some of my research mates here is about mobility as well. So maybe there's a way that we can conceptualize this fluid porous movement of artists and music across the region, as a form of mobility. We can also think about migration, not just in terms of people moving to different nation states, but of internal migration, especially historically. We're looking at rural to urban migration as a major factor in bringing up this popular music culture. Of course, those of you who are interested, the whole idea of nostalgia versus retro is very important, because you see a lot of new articulations of old styles right now in Malaysia of that Rock Kapak style. So there's a lot of call-outs to that now in contemporary Malaysian popular music. And of course, gender, I'm going to put a question mark there, because the issue of gender, aside from masculinity, right, is a big question mark in Malaysia, because it's also something that in official discourses gets repressed a lot. And I think there's a lot to be said about how masculinity is projected, or more so how masculinity, or this kind of masculinity, this glam rock Kapak masculinity was trying to be restrained and controlled by the state. I didn't get to talk about the ban of these Rock Kapak bands in the 90s and 80s on national television and radio, and how there was a huge issue about long hair, and there was actually a government initiative to cut the long hair of all these rock artists, and it actually happened. So we've got this kind of embodied, control issues happening. Of course, you have to talk about the ethnography of the fans right now, and Dr. Taqiyuddin is doing amazing work on that. I can't wait to see his work. I can't wait to talk to him as well, actually, about this. And we've got, we also need to think about the ethnography of record collecting, trading, and reissues. And for me, for now, just to end it off and go into discussion. Oh my God, please, if you haven't had, please check out the book Made in Nusantara. It is going to be out in March, and it's available for pre-order on Routledge. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope we can have a good discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, ADIL. Does anybody have questions? You could ask a question. Well, the first question, Mark Percival, I think, has asked, ADIL, can you say a little more about the multicultural issues in Malaysia and how that might play out in rock and glam?
Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks so much for tuning in. So yeah, multiculturalism in Malaysia, that's a huge one that deserves its own presentation. But basically, you have the ethnopolitics of Malaysia is kind of like a feature of political, social, and cultural life. In a nutshell, you do have one thing that I will say is that even though the music is considered Malay rock in nature, the industry of production surrounding it is highly multicultural, and it's also tied to different industries of production that are closely linked with people of particular ethnic backgrounds that dominate certain industries. So, for example, and you see this, in race music, right, in the States, but not obviously in a very different way. In Malaysia, you have a lot of music industry at the time was controlled by Chinese capitalists who own these companies, but they were also very supportive of the infrastructure. Without them, you won't have that. But they were marketing to the Malay demographic, and this, of course, is an issue that we need to discuss in more detail. And you also have non-Malays also performing and playing. You have in the Search Phenomenon album, you have Hilary Ang, who is a legendary guitarist, and he's also almost kind of like exoticized. Oh, check out this Chinese rock guitar player among the Malay community. But these are issues that obviously need to be complicated more. I'm grossly simplifying. And of course, you have musicians like Michael Virapan, who he's a mixed Chinese, Indian, Malaysian musician who plays keyboards on numerous recordings in the 80s and 90s. So the politics of race definitely need to be untangled here. But yes, need more time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Oh wow, Carl Devine dropped in. Nice. Okay. Yeah. Any further questions? I do have a bonus track.
Well, I hit the bonus track.
Excellent. Okay. I think it's lunchtime for those of you in the UK and in GMT. And it's also rather late actually for me, it's gig time. So like 9 p.m. in Malaysia is when we start, roughly when we start going to sound check. Okay, let's see. Okay, let me just hit up the bonus track. Okay, sound. So I didn't get to talk about the precursors to Rock Kapak in the Malay world. And in the 1960s, Malay rock and, okay, here we go. In the 1960s and 1970s, Malay rock and roll was drawing a lot of influences from the Beatles, Beatlemania, the Rolling Stones, and the Ventures. And you had, this is a very early stage of Malaysia or Malay world Nusantara nationhood, right? And you have a flurry of bands and groups from Singapore and from Malaysia, and also in Indonesia. I don't have much info on that. And you can see these are the styles that they were fashioning themselves in, right? Looks familiar for those of you who are fans of UK retro Britpop music of the era, hopefully. And of course, you have also this confrontation that's happening between Indonesia and Malaysia and the borders of Borneo, between Malaysia and Indonesia. And there were a lot of songs there were pop songs in Indonesia coming up about crushing Malaysia. There were a lot of patriotic songs coming out in Malaysia at the time. But there was this kind of what happened after this, like in 1968, Sanisa Huri, a Singaporean Malay singer, released a song called Baju Hijau, which is a song about a soldier like in the field of battle. And I can't really contextualize who she's talking about, because the song is about a brave soldier in a green uniform, but she's a Singaporean, and at the time Singapore had split from Malaysia. And there were no wars that I know of that were happening that Singapore was involved in, aside from the confrontation, which was actually already winding down. But there was the Vietnam War was happening at the time. So I don't know if it was just a trend, but I mean, let's just have a listen and you tell me what you think. I'll translate it for you later. So yeah, I'll stop there. There's some interesting comments. I'm sorry, I can't actually comment on the chat while playing the song. It kind of cuts off the song. But yes, Syed Omar Hussein, I think it could probably relate to the internal war that was happening in Malaysia. I mean, I'm sure some of you are like, why didn't you present about this instead? Right? But the reason is because I need help. So if those of you who are interested in that period of the internal guerrilla communist war, I think there's some collaborations to be had, especially to think about music at that time and the kind of themes that were coming up. I think I've stopped sharing, right? Yes, okay. Right.
Okay, well, thank you very much, ADIL, for a fantastic presentation. I'm sure everyone will give a muted round of applause. It was really interesting, and it's great to get an insight into Southeast Asian popular music studies and music of Malaysia in particular. I'd like to just quickly share a handful of notices with everybody before we finish. Just a couple of things to tell you about. that are going on. Here we go. So if you're not a member of IASPM, the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, you can go to iaspm.net and join there. And then you'll get information about research seminars and all our different events. So just a quick plug. IASPM, this seminar was being streamed live and recorded on YouTube. So you'll be able to watch it or link to it or show it to your students or whatever on the IASPM YouTube. Please sign up, subscribe and like our YouTube channel. I'm sounding more and more like an advert, never mind. The IASPM Conference 2021, you will probably know we had a conference planned this year in South Korea. It's now been delayed and will happen in 2022. So the call for papers will reopen in case people's situation has changed. People will be able to just easily have their presentation rolled on. We're still looking for a host for the conference in 2023. If you're interested in doing that, contact your branch. Branches may put forward that they'd like to host it, or you could email me if you want to discuss it directly. The next research seminar in March, in a month's time, 25th of March, will be presented by Aspen Norden and features Thomas Hilde of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and will look at transgressive pedagogies in the musicological classroom. I think that's probably about all we've got time for. We'll actually finish on time today. So just time to say another massive thank you for ADIL for his great presentation. And we look forward to seeing all of you, even the person I've just let in from the waiting room, seeing you next month on a YouTube channel or Zoom meeting, much like this one. Thank you very much. See you all soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.